With U.S. President Trump's Liberation Day tariffs upending the global trade order, how should the Philippines navigate? We speak with the managing director of global CEO advisory firm Teneo, who's advised firms with overall risk assessment at the regional and country level, as well as develop and help implement market entry divestment and risk mitigation strategies. With us now on Thought Leaders, Bob Herrera-Lim. Good to see you, Bob. Thank you so much for joining us. So let's baseline for a moment. It's April 22nd. Things can change, but as it is, we're at 10% tariffs right now. Philippines suffering from that with a proposed 17% from after this 90-day pause, which ends in July. But China's already charging 145% or 125% to the U.S., and the U.S. charging 145% to China. So from a planning perspective, where are we, especially from a risk advisory perspective?
Okay, I think we tell clients three things right now. The first is the world is changing significantly from what we knew it, right? 20 or 30 years ago, we were all talking about WTO, globalization, the free flow of goods, information, capital, and people. Right now, people are talking about immigration constraints. We are talking about 2 or 3 sort of spheres around the world. China, Europe, the United States. We are talking of countries, some of them moving back from globalization. So I think one of the first things we say is this is probably or could become a more fundamental change than what we've been used to in the past. Now, you remember COVID, right?
Yeah,
so COVID,
certainly do.
When COVID hit, people said, if we can only find the vaccine, then things can get back to normal. And normal was, going about our lives, doing our jobs and businesses, right? With this trade war, the question is, what is going to be normal? Because as I said, the fundamental ideas that seem to define the last 30 to 40 years are changing based on how the United States is now approaching these questions. So that's the first thing we tell CEOs. Don't think of this simply as next month, next year, once we're through the trade war, things are back to normal, they were as they were. No, you have to first think about that. So don't just fixate on the numbers. That's the first thing we're telling them. The second thing is, given this generational shift, this is a generational shift in terms of how trade and investment happens, there might be some opportunities for the Philippines if you are looking for some bright spots or the proverbial, silver lining in the cloud. And the cloud is the trade war. But the silver lining is the Philippines is one of the lower tariff countries. It can build new industrial capacity. Let's say some companies say, no, we can't trade from somewhere where tariff is 50, 60%, but we can sell from the Philippines where it's 10%. But to do that, the Philippines needs to do a lot of things. So it's not an automatic, right? So we can maybe make more for the US market. We can make more for other markets. So that's the second thing. So the first thing is things are changing more than any time in our lifetime. The second is maybe there's an opportunity. And the third thing is, given the uncertainty that most companies face and that it is nearly impossible to predict what the world will look like 30 days from now, 90 days from now, a year from now, what's the most important thing a company can do or we can do to protect ourselves? It is to build the relationships that matter. And these relationships are the ones where we sort of are able, that will help us navigate these things. So,
it sounds like fun to me.
Yes.
Because of all the uncertainty that you hadn't even faced, maybe in context from COVID compared to COVID, from maybe the 2007-08 global financial crisis, 97-98, Asian financial crisis. I'm wondering how the conversations go, though. You're a global CEO advisory firm, and you meet at around maybe near midnight, Manila time. What are the conversations like right now if there is no end game to what's going on?
We are like people trying to figure out what a puzzle looks like from the different pieces as they fall into place. So whether it is what the US government imposes as tariffs, how the Chinese react, how the EU reacts, how the different changes are taking place in the individual countries. So we're almost trying to piece together pictures using all these different components and all these different parts. And that's the challenge because the parts change as things change. So the US will do something, China will do something. Just the other day, China said, do not sacrifice China's interests when you negotiate with the US. So right now, if you're a country negotiating with the US in the coming weeks, you're also looking at how China will look at your negotiations and say, you can't, do anything that would prejudice China. So it's long conversations trying to figure out what's happening next and looking at the different parts and seeing if we can form a coherent picture for our clients.
I still remember the day I first got in touch with you, and that was the day before Liberation Day tariffs. But I got in touch with you because of another risk or potential risk, and that came up Northern Luzon, the escalation that we're seeing in Taiwan with China. So I wanted to get you for that comment, but then as it happens, it appears that it's become the bigger issue, the tariffs that were announced. You told me in a text, it's a shockwave. Southeast Asia has been hammered. So looking back, when you compare the escalation that's going on at the north and tariffs as a shockwave, which one is a bigger risk for the Philippines?
Well, the risk of conflict arising from the South China Sea or from Taiwan will always be there, right? But our sense is right now, any conflict involving the South China Sea will be quite limited. Neither the US, neither the Philippines, nor the US, nor China, I think in the near term, has any interest in not only provoking conflict, but in sustaining serious conflict. So there might be a lot of posturing, or in Tagalog, pagpapagwapo of all the players, but no one wants a war. I don't think it'll happen. So for us, the real shockwave, that's why I sent you that email saying it was a shockwave, was the tariffs, because the tariffs can fundamentally change global growth in the near term. It can change trading relationships. So in the near term, if you are thinking of people maybe losing their jobs in the Philippines, of OFWs working abroad losing their jobs, that could be the bigger shock in the near term. Let me give you an example. If global growth slows down, then our OFWs who work in the Middle East might suffer, because then the countries like Saudi, Qatar, the Gulf countries might say, we're going to slow down on infrastructure. And a lot of our countrymen go abroad to work in these industries, and they might lose their jobs. If there's a substantial slowdown in the US, especially people who hold stocks, yung pensionado, then they might stop going to cruises. And many of the cruise line workers are our countrymen. So the shock might not directly affect us, but it could affect our countrymen abroad who send money here. And that's the uncertainty that this creates.
But the visit of the U.S. Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, just, brought to mind that maybe we shouldn't take it in compartments. His visit came just a week before the tariffs came through, and he did pledge that we're allies, we're treaty allies. He also visited Japan and said the same message. Could there be a timing, a sort of strategy there that they're kind of trying to compartmentalize that we are treaty partners, but you still got to deal with the tariff issue separately?
Yes, I think, and it's one of the things, right? This is a new administration, and maybe the wheels are spinning on their own in the defense and security side and on the economic side, and they're not exactly coordinated. So I think that's what's happening. So the Philippines has a long-standing historical and defense relationship with the United States. And because of that long-standing relationship, definitely there are ties that go not just to the top, but in the infrastructure, from our military to their military, from our defense to their defense. And I think that's what we're seeing right now in the Philippine defense relationship, a recognition of long-standing ties, of long-standing relationships. But at the same time, you also have an administration in the States that says, but we've been taken advantage of by trade. So we have to apply it to everyone, regardless of whether you are a long-standing ally or whether you are a Vietnam or a Cambodia or an EU. There's a different game that we're also playing. So I think that's what we're seeing. So you can't exactly say that they align or they fit. There are two different wheels spinning right now.
And it makes your job all the more interesting because you got to consider the layers there of the geopolitics and the economic risks. James Stavridis, I got across his Bloomberg column on April 17th. He said, history turns on small hinges, and we need to watch 5 yellow lights. He mentioned cyber attacks, Taiwan incursions, the South China Sea, Beijing's naval construction, and the escalating trade war. So he cites these as the 5 signs that US and China will go to a hot war. So that's guns and battles, shock and awe and all that, versus a trade war. So what is the risk of potentially a hot war emanating from all this rather than a trade war?
I think right now I wouldn't say it's zero, but it's definitely a lower probability than a trade war. Okay,
Even lower after the
yes,
tariffs.
Yes, I still think between the countries there's a sense that if we all go to war, it would be the destruction that would be rained upon individual economies would be much, much more significant than from any trade war. That's why in the discounting of outcomes, we still think that there's a higher sort of discounting that you have to give to a war being done in the next 2 to 3 years at the very least. So it's really the damage from a trade war that we are worried about. Obviously, you can't downplay the possibility of a miscalculation between any of two sides that leads to a hot war, but I don't think there is any intent right now that a hot war serves anyone's outcome in the near term. They're obviously preparing for any possible conflict, but preparation is different from intending to start one.
You talk about discounting, but everybody is at loggerheads at how to price risk. And I came across New York Times David Brooks writing also on April 17th an opinion saying Trumpism is about ego, appetite, and acquisitiveness. There's the attacks on law firms, US aid, American universities, NATO, and then global trade. I know that you've been involved in US aid and you're a lawyer and you've also done some work in government and the private sector. How do we then price risk when all these sectors, if you will, or ecosystems are attacked all at the same time?
That is the most difficult question right now for many people. That's why you saw the bond markets, right? You saw them going up and down. You see US stock markets right now going up several hundred points in a day, or even 1,000 points down, 1,000 points up over the past 3 to 4 weeks.
And that wasn't priced in?
Yes. Those markets are having difficulty pricing in different outcomes. Yesterday, I think the Dow was down like 900 points, right? So even markets, the ones we consider to be the most efficient, where you have knowledgeable market players, knowledgeable traders who are on their Bloombergs, who are trying to absorb all the information that they can, you still see the volatility in asset prices. You see gold rising, right? Which is normally a refuge for uncertainty, right? Bitcoin is fluctuating all over the place, crypto. So you see from the normal traditional instruments in which people try to sort of hedge their risks, whether US treasuries, whether gold, a lot of volatility, which is a sign that people are having difficulty pricing risk. That is why for many of our clients, our emphasis is, given that it's difficult to put a price on what is the risk going to be 6 months, a year from now, what's the interest rate going to be, what's the discount rate going to be, what do you need to pay, given that it is difficult, what you need more than trying to peg a number, which is going to give you a false sense of comfort, is to have relationships that will allow you to assess things as they develop. And that's one of the things that we try to do, that we tell you, okay, we're headed towards the worst case outcomes, or no, we're headed towards the better outcomes, not as bad as people thought it would be. And figuring out where those outcomes will be 3 months or 6 months from now is the big challenge for many companies and for many individuals as well.
We saw how bad it could get when bond yields went up and then dollar fell, stocks fell. That wasn't usual. That kind of made people think that there could be financial market stresses coming out of this Liberation Day. Could that be a point of reference, would you say, for businesses, CEOs out there, that once that happens, maybe he'll change his mind?
Yes.
And do another 90-day pause?
Yes. So we've seen basically the US administration react to the bond markets, right? The bond markets pricing in a high amount of risk, and basically the US administration saying, okay, we recognize the risk is increasing based on the fall in bond prices and the rise in the long-term yields. So to some extent, there is some reaction by the administration, but you've also seen the administration say, you know what, stock market goes up 1,000, stock market goes down 1,000. We don't care. There's a long-term plan, right? So I think I think what's happening right now is the U.S. government is also trying to figure out the best way to accomplish its goals without creating problematic or financial stresses that would threaten, creating a bigger financial, shall we say, crisis for the U.S. or for the world. So that's the big challenge right now. But again, the way the markets have been behaving shows you that pricing of risk right now is very, very difficult and very short term even.
As early as April 4th, you said that governments in Southeast Asia are limited in how they can respond to Trump's reciprocal tariffs with little strategy beyond attempting to negotiate. How would you assess how the Philippine government's reacted or acted so far?
Well, it's been published, right? Frederick Goa, the special advisor to the president, is going to the U.S. Malaysia is also going to negotiate. Most of the Southeast Asian countries are going to negotiate because trade is such an important part of our economies. But at the same time, I described the Philippines, we are price takers. So unlike the EU, unlike China, we can't impose tariffs and say we have a strong negotiating position. Our negotiating position is basically we can come in, propose that trade can be beneficial still to both sides, and how do we fix the issues that the U.S. sees with the trade that's happening with us. So sometimes the U.S. say you'll have to fix currency manipulation, you'll have to fix labor standards, you'll have to fix some things before we can consider that the trading relationship has been the trading issues have been addressed in this relationship. So that's how we will negotiate. And right now, to be honest, again, Cathy, that's the uncertainty here. Many countries are going there with maybe a laundry list of offers, but unsure of which offers will be enough to sort of address the U.S. perceptions regarding what the problems with trade are. So we're going to watch closely Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, for how they negotiate with the U.S. And that's what we're going to watch for the next 4 to 8 weeks.
So how much do you think it's going to cost for a free trade agreement? Because that's what Secretary Goh said he'd go there for, and negotiate a free trade agreement at a time of deglobalization.
Yes. The challenge there will be twofold. The first is it takes time to negotiate a free trade agreement, right? Because you have to go line by line, you have to go through different sort of items and then figure out what needs to work out. Normally, a free trade agreement takes months or years to work out. So maybe we can get an initial, okay, we'll start negotiating, but what the final outline of that will be difficult. Now, another thing is the question of how much will the Philippines benefit from an FTA with the US, because many of our products already enter the US at relatively low tariff rates. So unless we are able to sort of encourage investment into new industries, right? If we go from just simply, the semicon industries we have right now, and we go into bigger industries, whether it's battery development, whether it is more semicon assembly, that's the time when a free trade agreement might work for us. But right now, we don't seem to have the industrial profile for it to be a huge benefit for us. We need to do a lot more.
So we're missing a lot of steps there in the supply chain. So
Yes.
It's impossible, you're not seeing it come to fruition, that we're not going to be able to earn free trade agreement status unless someone comes to us to want to set up shop.
Yes.
So we'll pull in the ASEAN then. Maybe that's a conversation that might work out as a silver lining. What are you seeing?
Yeah, there are different ways in which this could work out as a silver lining for us, okay? I'm not saying that it's automatically good, but our opportunity is, for the best part of the last 30, 40 years, right? You had the whole trading scheme, which was stuff was made mainly in China, southeastern China, Thailand, okay, Malaysia and Singapore, right? Now, in terms of being exported to the US. Now, if the tariff system that the US ultimately imposes reshapes this, then some of that manufacturing could move to us if we have lower tariffs or an FTA. But that is not the only determinant of whether or not these companies will invest here, right? If you're a semicon manufacturer in the US or in Europe, you're thinking, okay, Philippines might have lower tariffs. Does it have the energy? Does it have the manpower? Does it have the infrastructure, the ports for me to ship stuff? So for us to be able to at least sort of reduce the pain from a tariff war, we also have to do things that improve our competitiveness as a manufacturing economy. And that's something we've struggled to do for the better part of the last 30, 40 years.
What's going to break that impasse? 30, 40 years, gone nowhere when it comes to having that manufacturing status of an economy. Could the tariffs drive it?
A little bit, it could be contributory, but it's not going to determine that outcome, right?
What will determine it?
We have to make the right investments. We have to make the right investments into people, into the education of our kids, right? Because if, well, I was in fact talking to one company that was invested here in semiconductors, and I said, what's the biggest challenge that you have with Philippine labor? And he said the biggest challenge was the ability to think critically, to adapt to changing circumstances. So we are good at following a list of sort of procedures, but the moment there's a challenge, there's something breaks down, something doesn't work, our ability to sort of fix those problems is much more limited. So our education system needs work. It's a constant problem, right? We need better infrastructure, whether you're talking housing, whether you're talking roads, whether you're talking power. The predictability of all these things need to be improved, including ports. So there's a lot of stuff that needs work. I know DEC has been trying to do that, but definitely we need to do more. We need to accelerate more and to sell the idea abroad that we are doing more.
And I thought we had foreign investors at English-speaking labor force.
Like many things that works for some things, right? It works for the BPO sector, right? But to bring in investors, the English-speaking workforce is only one part. It's not the majority when they think of the Philippines. They still think I need workers who can be trained. I need workers who are available when we need them with the specific skills. So that's where we're still lacking.
China's leader Xi Jinping had this massive Southeast Asian tour planned, but then it made a big splash visiting 3 countries in the ASEAN: Cambodia, Vietnam, Malaysia. We weren't part of that visit. What kind of message does that send?
I think that trip was planned well before this whole brouhaha.
But he could have added the Philippines, right? If we were that attractive tariff-wise, because we're only 17%.
No, I think we have other issues with China that would prevent Xi Jinping from coming here, right? And which will prevent him from coming here until we work those out. No, we have to be honest. We have had tense, or we have had, shall we say, friction with China over the South China Sea, right? And we always hope that there will always be a path where the 2 countries, our country, even ASEAN, and China will be able to work things out. We're not there yet, right? We see the news reports of daily confrontations in the South China Sea between our Coast Guard and their Coast Guard. And right now, that dominates much of the discussions. I don't think trade is a huge component of the interaction between Philippine and Chinese officials, or will be anytime soon. So if you are China, you're definitely going to visit your near countries, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos. You're going to visit maybe at some point Thailand, then Singapore, then Indonesia. But there's still enough friction between us that they probably won't put us on that list.
So what are we going to miss out, or what are we missing out if they've had negotiations, the big leader visited them, didn't visit us? What could we lose?
What we could lose is this. Right now, the world is trying to figure out how to adapt to the changing circumstances of higher tariffs from the US and possibly a more restrictive global trading environment, right? Now, there are countries, China benefits from global trading, and it would like to continue the trading scheme as we have. Europe, to some extent, would also like to continue that. Australia, many of our countries, Japan, or our partners, right? Japan, Korea, India, would also like to see the trading system at least be preserved to a good extent and not collapse. So our risk is, if we don't participate in these discussions, that a new trading system emerges or other arrangements emerge, like new trading blocks, and we're not active participants in that. So imagine, like maybe let's say, imagine if these tariffs become persistent, they're high. Then at some point, do Korea, Japan, India say we need a new trading arrangement that will involve East Asia and India and maybe Australia and maybe Europe and maybe China. So all of these, we have to be at that table when that conversation happens. Is it going to happen next month? Probably not. Is it going to happen over the next 3 to 5 years? It might. Or we could even go, it probably will, because if growth slows down, then we have to find new sources of growth, which could be new trading arrangements. So we have to take a look at the long-term horizon as well in our relationship with China and the rest of the world, not just on the territorial issues, but on the evolution of global trading as well, which takes a lot of effort.
Can we lead those conversations in the ASEAN?
Can we
Do we
lead them?
have enough leverage to lead the conversations within this regional bloc?
I'll be honest, as a Filipino, I would like to say yes, but my practical answer is no.
Because
There are two countries in Southeast Asia that basically have sort of the what you might call the institutional capability, right? The long memory, the bureaucracy, the political ability, and that's Singapore and Vietnam, to some extent Indonesia. Indonesia has a very professional foreign service with long history. Singapore always thinks of the long game. Vietnam thinks of its long game too. And then you have Malaysia with its experience in exporting. We have very good people in the government, but we can't seem to yet go out and say, okay, we'd like to lead these discussions for the benefit of ASEAN, for the benefit of Asia. That, I think, is something that we need to work on still.
let me pick on Vietnam because I've been observing, Vietnam among the first nations singled out by Trump for showing willingness to negotiate over tariffs. So that was one point of learning. That was a phone call between Trump and the Prime Minister. And then just days after hosting Xi, Vietnam posted on its website that the nation has a unique bond with the US. So it's talking to two of the biggest warring trade partners at the same time, sending positive messages. What can we learn from Vietnam?
Vietnam thinks the very long game, right? So Vietnam has many of the same issues that we have, right? They have territorial issues with China, right? At the same time, they export a lot to China. They export a lot to the US. They want US firms to come in and integrate them into global value chains. But at the same time, they also need the Chinese value chains. So if you are Vietnam, what you do or what Vietnam is doing is telling both countries, you're important to us. We'd like to strike deals with you that serve all our interests. And it's not just ideological, it is economic interest. So what we can learn from Vietnam is you have to take the very long view, that these are big trading partners, that if you're able to maximize your economic relationship with them, it can be beneficial to you. So to use the Filipino word, hindi lang palayuan ng yung palakihan ng ego, hindi lang palakihan ng ulo. No, for Vietnam, it is how do we deal with you in a way that benefits all of us, and then it communicates that to the two other countries or to whatever country it's negotiating with, but with its national interest as its priority. So ego plays a very low role in Vietnam's diplomacy. You will see their, it's golf. You will see their long game being played always.
But it's not fair. They don't have West Philippine Sea and the incursions.
Well, that is what they do. But, there is in Vietnam, if you go to Vietnam, there is strong domestic suspicion of China, right, among their citizens because of all of these. And it is one of the goals always of the Chinese leadership, of the Vietnamese leadership, to keep these sentiments under control, to prevent them from blowing up because they know it won't serve them anything to have a conflict with China. They've already had conflict with China in the past, and they don't want it. They want to grow by participating in value chains. And that's one of the things we don't feel because we're not a manufacturing economy. For the Vietnamese, they get a lot of investment from Chinese firms coming in and setting up factories, and they make a lot of money by selling back into China the components for China, right? So for them, there is a very high economic return to keeping the Chinese and the Americans at peace with them. We don't export that much to China. We don't export that much. So our incentives are a bit lower, and that's something we have to work on.
But that's not a recommendation you could apply to the Philippines, keeping it down.
Well, if this is, again, I will caution, this is not the sort of the opinion of our firm. This is my personal opinion. China, whether you think of it as number one or number two, will for the foreseeable future be one of the world's largest trading economies. So will the US. If we want to grow, we will have to trade with these countries. So we will have to balance our interests. On the one hand, we have to protect our national sovereignty. We have to protect our national interests. But at the same time, China will be one of the key players in the region. It will be one of the key players globally for both trade and investment, for tourism as well. So we have to find ways to sort of manage all of this in a way that works for us. And again, not just for sake of egos, for the sake of saying things, but really thinking, how does this play out in the long term for the benefit of the Philippines, for the benefit of growth, of stability.
Japan has had an interesting reaction so far. It's kicked off tariff discussions with the US and Washington last week, and they focused on the non-tariff barriers. Speaking of car safety, relaxing car safety, so that American cars can get imported to Japan at least cost and compete with the local car companies there. What do you make of going through non-tariff barriers as a way of negotiating? Do we have enough leverage as Japan has?
Probably not, because we don't have as big a market as the Japanese. We don't have as big a market for American cars, right? If American cars got into the Japanese market, it would be a significantly bigger market than what we have. So non-tariff barriers will definitely be a talking point whenever we negotiate with the US. It could be about the currency. It could be about the standards that we impose on imports. It could be many things, like state support for some of our own products, right? Because the US has said what makes them unhappy about the trading scheme is it's unfair. And this unfairness takes the form of everything from non-conformity with labor standards, currency manipulation, non-tariff barriers such as safety standards. Okay, so the US, when it negotiates with many of these countries, will take a look at this, and that's why we're all watching closely what Vietnam does, what Thailand does, because you'll have all these rules being debated, like how do you prevent transshipment, right? Where basically there's little value added, but the good is just transited through Vietnam. The US will be watching out. How do you apply rules of origin? So all these things we will see being negotiated over the next few weeks or months.
Speaking of that, the transshipment, the supply chain, it really becomes an interesting topic when you speak with the electronics manufacturers. I spoke with Perry Ferrer, the chairman and CEO of EMS Corp, telling me that on a worst case scenario, there will be a shift in the supply chain. What have you assessed, and how critical would this be, considering that electronics are our biggest export to the US?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, the numbers will matter, right? So if the tariffs on, let's say, something being produced in Malaysia or Thailand is high enough versus the lower tariffs on the Philippines, then some of that might shift here if, as I said in our earlier part of our discussion, we're able to convince investors that, not only will they benefit from tariffs, but that we've improved our investment profile, right? Whether it is, approvals, licenses, permits, infrastructure, education, quality of workforce, if we can convince them, then that might happen. So at the end of the day, it will all depend on what the final tariffs are that are negotiated. Because let's say we get 17% and Vietnam gets 20%, you're not going to move from Vietnam to the Philippines on a 3% differential, given the efficiencies that Vietnam already has.
Can we just not seek relief?
We will seek relief. I'm pretty sure DECGO will seek relief.
But he said the operative word was negotiate.
Well, that will be part of the negotiation, right? But the question is, what is the U.S. willing to grant, right? Because the U.S., again, it goes back to the question of why did the U.S. impose these tariffs? And there's a belief within the current administration that the US has been taken advantage of by all other countries, as reflected in the trade deficits that they run, that the US has with all these other countries. So the question, therefore, is what will the US see as being acceptable concessions from the individual countries? So the concessions that it might see as acceptable from Vietnam might be different from the concessions that it sees as acceptable from the Philippines. If we get by with only minimum concessions, we'll be very happy, right? So the big challenge is we don't know what these concessions will look like.
But can't we bring in defense treaty partner as part of the leverage?
That will be part of that.
Because we've got those F-16 fighter jets, if I'm not mistaken, $5.6 billion now in peril, because it's going to cost a lot more.
Yes. So the question, what value will they put on those contracts?
Those tariffs, and Lockheed Martin has got like hundreds of suppliers around the world, so we're not going to be able to get them.
Yes, so that will be part, right? So probably those suppliers will say, don't go too hard on the Philippines because we have deals pending with the Philippines. Vietnam is also saying they will buy more LNG from the US. So everyone is putting forward what they believe to be sort of negotiating points, right? It can be our offer to buy defense equipment. Like Thailand is thinking of ethane or methane or some kind of chemicals. Vietnam is offering to buy more planes and LNG. So everyone's going to put their offer on the table. We will have our own offer. The challenge, as I said, is we can have all these efforts. The question is, what is the other side of the table going to say in terms of, yeah, this one has a big value. This one, you're going to buy them anyway, so we don't really care about them. So the big challenge for the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, all of the Southeast Asian countries is, what does the other side see as valuable in terms of these negotiations?
So is that going to make America great again?
That is the big question, right? It's a difficult question to answer, but definitely whether we phrase it in the Make America Great Again, it changes the way the US behaves towards the rest of the world. And in doing so, countries have to rethink how the world system will look like. Because let's be honest, for the better part of the last half century, the global trading system has been defined by principles that the US pushed, right? Whether you're talking Bretton Woods, multilaterals, globalization, that is now changing. So will it make America great again? It's difficult to bring some stuff back to the US in terms of manufacturing. You will never be able to manufacture t-shirts in the US as efficiently as a factory, or even shoes, as efficiently as a factory in Vietnam or Indonesia or the Philippines or China might do it, right? So ultimately the question is, what industries will make, what kind of return, right? When the industries return to the US, what will make the US say, yeah, this is fine, we're happy, this is what we set out to agree? Because if they want to bring in t-shirts and the return of, shoe manufacturing, that's going to be not only difficult, but it will end up in very expensive shoes and t-shirts for the US. So they could be shooting themselves in the foot. So it really depends. And again, Cathy, you've seen people negotiate in business. The challenge is you have to figure out what the other side wants and is willing to give. And that is what Southeast Asian countries are trying to figure out now. So I don't think this question will be answered with any definiteness within the next 6 to 8 weeks, because there's going to be negotiations with Europe. There's going to be negotiations with Japan, Korea. We are a small fish in a huge pond. So we're going to have to see how the bigger fish survive in this environment as well.
But you still got to give your clients some answers. You've got those that are inquiring, maybe fulfilling transactions, maybe even mergers and acquisitions, divestments. What are you seeing from your perspective at the advisory
many of them
firm?
are on hold right now, right? Because they're saying, because you don't want to be exposed to something that might turn out differently in a couple of months' time, right? So if you're wanting to buy a company and it's producing a lot of stuff in Vietnam right now, you are wondering, what will Vietnamese growth look like 6 months from now if the tariff war is not resolved?
So are they on hold because you said so, or because they said, no, I'm not deploying my CapEx?
Yes, I think many of them are seeing the uncertainty.
So they come to you with answers already. I'm holding back. And
Yes,
is that okay?
Yes, is that okay? And how will it play to governments, right? If you go to a government and you say, or if you go to somebody and say, I'm holding back on an investment, because the question is, how then do you limit the damage from your company, right? So let's say you're a company that now produces in Vietnam, and you are worried about tariffs. So you're thinking, okay, one of my contingency plans is to move some of my, let's say, shoe production from Vietnam to the Philippines. Let's just say. So you're thinking, okay, I'm pulling out. What then do I need to think about? One of the challenges, if you just pull out, the Vietnamese government will say, you left us at a time of great difficulty. And they will remember that. It's the same thing in Indonesia. So how you divest is very important. How you treat your workers, if you have to close a factory because it's no longer economical, is very important now. Because I remember there were I can't name the companies, but we have had clients who left sort of like, let's say, Indonesia in the 1998 financial crisis. And then after several years, when Indonesia had stabilized and Asia was growing again, they came back to Indonesia. You know what the Indonesians told them? We remember you left. So the advice is not just on the mergers, it is how you do your business during a time of great difficulty. How do you communicate to your employees? How do you communicate to government and stakeholders that during a time of great uncertainty, there are negative things happening? You want to be there as a stakeholder, not just as a simple financial transaction. But again, we have to admit, we don't have the crystal ball to how the world will look 6 months from now, a year from now, or 4 years from now. So it's really important for businesses to have a pulse on what's happening and not think that, oh, somebody just predicted 5% growth for 2025, that you can write that in black ink and hold them to that. It's not going to happen. It can be 4%, it can be 6%, it can be higher, lower. It all depends on what happens in the next 6 to 12 months.
And also building relationships. That's what you said at the start of this interview, which is why your advisory firm can stay in business in
Yes.
this time of uncertainty.
No, to be honest, you have to build relationships. I remember, and I'll go back to this. In 2011, Thailand had this massive flooding. I don't know if you remember that. It was massive flooding in Thailand because after the rains came, several factories were closed. We're talking about the big names in electronics and autos couldn't ship abroad, right? So when we're asked, what do you advise firms to do that? I said, well, we're not in the weather prediction business. We can't predict what the rain is, but we can tell you this. If you have the right relationships, you can figure out the solution. So some companies that were exporting through Bangkok, we said, you have to find relationships that will allow you to export through the South as well. And that's like one of the things in the Philippines. I'll give you an example. There's a scenario where the Philippines is blockaded in the South China Sea, right? Let's say that's a 30% probability. If you are an importer in Manila, how do you prepare for that? What's the advice? We give them this advice. You have to look for different ports in which you can bring in goods. Now, what you can do is go to these ports and build the relationship already. Know what's available. Look at who the forwarders are. Therefore, build the relationships that if one day the blockade does happen, and no one hopes it will happen, you can pick up the phone and say, hey, I need to bring in some stuff from Malaysia, from Singapore, from Indonesia. Can we drop this off at the port of Davao or Cebu? And then can you bring it to our factory in Batangas, etc.? You build the relationships for that alternative outcome. So that's the important thing.
Okay, well, that's really useful information. Thank you so much. And for also giving us advice when we need it most. Bob Herrera-Lim from Teneo. Catch us again next Thursday, 9 p.m. Philippine Standard Time on One News. You can also check out The Long Conversation on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. And if you haven't done so, like or follow my social media pages. I'm Cathy Yang, and this is Thought Leader.